What is the most racist and backwards place on Earth? If you thought perhaps the Uyghur camps of Xinjiang, you're wrong. If you think perhaps Libya, where they still enslave black people to this day, you're so wrong, because the most racist place on Earth is right here. You know it's in the name, right? Brigham Young. He said that if the white man mixes his seed with the black person, they both drop dead. Oof. Now, if you aren't familiar with BYU, I'll give you a quick rundown. The school is privately owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more colloquially known as the Mormon Church. Since its founding, the school has remained religious, striking a balance between secular teaching and theology. Students are therefore expected to follow religious standards, summarized in what's called the Honor Code. In exchange for subsidizing a mere 70% of tuition, the church demands ludicrous standards such as being honest, being chaste, abstaining from alcohol, and dressing modestly. Such puritanical rules naturally makes it one of America's most conservative schools, surpassed only by BYU Idaho. BYU is increasingly garnering the reputation of being racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic. They'll no doubt gain a few more labels down the line. Racism is rife on campus, according to some. Slurs are hurled, minorities oppressed, people who indulge in worldly vices are shunned. BYU truly is a theocratic, totalitarian university.
But it is. It's based in secrets and fear.
Yeah.
And shame.
But alternatively, many people actually studying here would say BYU is one of the friendliest universities you can find. It's safe, it's clean. If anything, people go out of their way to try and include you in things going on around campus, almost to an annoying degree. I personally would have no reservation in saying that the people you meet here, whilst perhaps old-fashioned, are some of the nicest people you will meet in America. The standards expected of students, whilst admittedly higher than other universities, makes it one of the most disciplined but charitable campuses around. While there are some kinks like any other school, most faculty and students are coming from a place of genuine care. I know that my endorsement will mean nothing to critics of BYU. Who cares that someone is kind and caring? That's all neutralized by their microaggressions. People can be well-meaning and still racist, you know. In the public square, being a genuinely good person that treats people with respect and care doesn't mean anything. The only way to be considered a good person in the eyes of the world is to abide by 3 simple qualities. No more, no less. Don't murder, don't rape, although those 2 are optional, and 3, have the correct orthodox opinions. Congratulations, you are now welcomed into the Good People's Club. You say the right things. You say your PC Hail Marys. You can go through life as one of the good guys, not you. People at BYU may not murder and rape, but they sure as hell have the wrong opinions. Racism has really been a hot topic at the time of me filming this, so I'm going to focus on that. BYU's supposed racism comes in 2 forms: outright explicit acts of racism and more quietly harboring anti-black sentiment. An example of the first would be the recent case of a student shouting the N-word at a black player during the female volleyball game between BYU and Duke University. That is an explicit act of hate carried out on campus. As of right now, the police and the school have not found any evidence that it was actually shouted. People who are inclined to not like the school, obviously they don't want to hear that. We're in more of a believe all victims climate rather than an innocent until proven guilty one. But, I will continue assuming this did happen. I'll be clear from the top. If someone shouted the N-word at her, that is bad. That is unequivocally bad. It goes without saying, right? Because this is agreed upon by practically anyone that you'll meet. That behavior, shouting a slur at a minority, do you condone that sort of behavior personally? No. Would you condone that sort of action?
Oh, absolutely not.
Do you condone that behavior personally?
No, I think that's terrible.
I have 2 questions on that. Someone allegedly shouted the N-word at one of the black players. Do you condone that sort of behavior on campus?
No.
Do you condone that sort of behavior?
No. And obviously, yeah, don't condone that behavior.
Okay. Of all the students I asked, and there were a lot of them, every one of them condemned it wholeheartedly. And this is where the story ends, right, CNN? No one agrees with it. It was carried out by some pariah student. A student trying to be hurtful to someone does not mean the school is racist. And even if the school did mishandle the situation, that also does not equate racism. But the reason this was not the end of the story, and it went on to make national news, It's because really, all people wanted was to pin down the school as racist. It is in ideological interest to hang this over the school's head. I've seen my whole life the thrill it gives people to catch the church in its mistakes. They love it. And today especially, nothing excites people more than to call out a white Christian conservative school for being bigoted. I mean, it's one of the only things left to do to get the euphoric high of being a righteous soldier against oppression. Like, real bastions of racism have become so few that the only way to express anti-racism is to go on message boards or YouTube and rant at how racist faculty are for allowing this event to happen. People will take this instance, they'll couple it with the fact that there are prevailing conservative attitudes on campus, and they'll say that this racist outburst is a product of the campus's conservative atmosphere. The church's history of racism and conservatism allows these racists to feel comfortable to act this way. Richard Spencer's! The actual racist BYU fan is secondary. He's like a squirrel compared to the real prize buck, which is the church.
The racism and the misogyny and the homophobia or the anti-Christian rhetoric, the anti-Mormon rhetoric, that's Mormonism.
The second manifestation of BYU's racism is what I was alluding to just then. It's the bigoted opinions held by students. A group making the rounds on TikTok recently is the Menaces. They've done a pretty good job getting students to give quite poorly worded advocacy for conservative ideals.
I don't know, that's really tough. Because I want to say yes, because I want to empathize and I want to love, but I also feel like BYU is so unique, you know?
In fairness to the students, it's not easy to concisely deliver your thoughts on the spot in front of a camera. I certainly don't do it great, and I can redo takes. From anti-LGBT to anti-BLM, BYU students seem to oppose everything that's orthodoxy in the liberal world. Let me say up front, I don't have any personal issues with the Menaces. In fact, they actually interviewed me a while back.
Malcolm X.
The international students know it more than
They were very polite, they weren't confrontational, and I think they liked me because I did get their question right. So I strictly disagree with them on ideological grounds. I've seen people on the internet have a field day with these ignorant, sheltered Mormons giving the most bigoted beliefs, but in like the most polite way possible. People are fascinated by the juxtaposition of seeming so friendly and yet holding the most profoundly backwards beliefs. It's like the Westboro Baptist Church at a university. So let's have a look at some of these videos and see just how indoctrinated these students are. A lot of like the Phase 1 Menaces videos, it's just like, who said this, Hitler or Brigham Young? So I think that's a good place to start.
If a white man mixes his blood with the African race, the penalty is death on the spot. Now, who said that, Brigham Young or KKK Grand Wizard David Duke?
It was probably Brigham Young, huh?
It was Brigham Young.
Yes, unfortunately, the rumors are true. A man who lived 150 years ago had some pretty backwards views on race. Call the press. I'm gonna let you finish, but I'd just like to interject here and say, this is a pretty rough quote from Brigham Young. This is probably the worst thing that he said, and there really isn't much to say to defend or give context to what he's saying. He was known for his fiery language to emphasize what he felt was important, and clearly, he felt strongly against interracial relationships. In my opinion, he had a heavy blind spot that he probably inherited from his upbringing, and it was something that Joseph didn't really have. It's well known that his rhetoric got the church in a lot of trouble in the early days, specifically in things like the Mormon War. Ultimately, though, the reason he still receives reverence is because of what he achieved in his tenure. He likely kept the church alive during its most turbulent years. Another sort of similar example that popped into my mind is Martin Luther. His questioning of the Catholic Church's authority was supremely historically significant and critical to the West's development, even though what he said about Jews is equally as heinous as what Brigham said about blacks. So just let it be known, I'm being apologetic for his achievements, not for everything that he believed in. Unfortunately, also, everybody that lived 150 years ago had backwards views on race. That's the nature of living in the past. You work with and are limited by the knowledge around you. It sucks that the past isn't as pristine as the present, but that's human history. As disturbing as it is to people who've never heard this before, Brigham Young's views were not abnormal for where he came from. When you consider that half the country or more had the same views as him at that time, that should tell you that he is more a victim of their education than he is personally evil. And this knowledge deficiency extends to everyone that's contributed to our world. All of them had some sort of racist or backwards beliefs. The ones you think don't probably just didn't have all their opinions recorded. Left-wing people, see anything you like? Well, they're all racist. Honestly, you can type any historical figure Add racist to it, and you'll see how problematic they are. Of course, there's varying degrees to how racist these people were, but the point is, most people in the past would hold intolerable views by today's standards because that is the world they grew up in. Like, you really think that before Europeans encountered Ibram X. Kendi, they were all morally evil? They weren't. They were just working in the dark. It's arrogance and babyish virtue signaling to condemn your ancestors for working with the knowledge they had at the time. You can only hope your descendants will be a lot more forgiving than you are. And what bothers me the most is this is basically just asked of Europeans. We have to be babysat on how we appreciate our ancestors. While the Mongolians are building their 43rd Genghis Khan statue, we can only appreciate the slither of our ancestors that had views completely congruent with 2022. Well, I for one will not do that. I recognize what they did wrong, but I still value them as my forebearers. They worked, they lived their lives, they suffered to fight for what they thought was right. And Godspeed to them. By the way, while we're on this tangent, it annoys me that people think only the North can celebrate their ancestors because they were on the right side of that war. Sorry, South, be ashamed of where you come from. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's a good psychological message for an already poor part of the country. You are racist for honoring your history. You have dishonorable blood. Check your privilege. It's a textbook way of neutering a people. You kill their culture by erasing their history. Returning to Brigham, like everyone knows these opinions are wrong. We're celebrating the work he did to create this state and grow the church. Like, that's what we're celebrating. It's unparalleled the work he did for us. I'm infinitely grateful for the work Brigham Young and his contemporaries did in my country, despite the fact that he most certainly wouldn't have approved of my mixed race background. I don't celebrate him for that. He was wrong on that, and he admits that he's flawed. I'm celebrating everything he did to bring me here today. Celebrating your ancestors is not celebrating every deed they did. Like, no one views it that way. Celebrating your ancestors is celebrating the fact that they managed to create you and everything you love in this world. It may sound illogical, because it is. It's like an instinctual feeling that happens in all cultures. It's normal and it's natural, so I refuse to go through a Chinese cultural revolution where we scrub all references to the past. By all means, discard what they got wrong, but don't discard what they did for you. Heritage is an important part of culture, and culture is the only way to tie us to this land. It's the only way to view where you live as something more than just where you work and sleep. You take away what ties you to this land, and you won't care what happens to it. Your children will see no value in preserving it. But I'm an amicable guy. I want everyone's history to be acknowledged. So here's a proposition to try and find the golden mean here. Rather than take down the Brigham Young statues and replace them with Jane Manning, build a new Jane Manning statue and put her on campus alongside other notable members. Show the full heritage of the church and all of our pioneers. In my capital city, we have a statue of Winston Churchill, a man who rallied our country against the Nazis. He was also a staunch colonialist and, in hindsight, had some pretty cringeworthy views about Indians. But just down the road from him is a statue of Mahatma Gandhi, a man Churchill despised and a man who stood up to the empire through peaceful protest. Both of them, to me, represent an important part of our history, and it shows the progression of our country. Look, I'm not hardlined on this. There's certainly figures that are irredeemably awful that you probably shouldn't make a statue of, but Brigham Young is not one of them.
Okay. The question is, does reverse racism exist?
Yes, reverse racism is real. There's no question about that. If we want to discuss the scale of racism against white people, then we can disagree on exactly how prevalent and serious it is, but undoubtedly white people, and that's really what this question is about, white people can be the victims of genuine racial abuse. To suggest otherwise is purposely provocative, and I would say gaslighting. The traditional view of racism is discrimination against someone purely on the basis of their race or ethnicity. By your grandpappy's definition, white people can be the victims of racism. Racism was then redefined by academics to say that it requires institutional power. You must have the power of the system behind you to inflict real damage. Now, to be charitable to the left, what they're trying to do is say that racism is only damaging if there's a power imbalance. And there is a logic to this, obviously. Like, an adult punching a child is worse than a child punching an adult. Like, one will damage the other far more than the other way around. So bullying the one black kid in class is a lot more distressing and damaging than the one black kid antagonizing the white kids, right? The problem with this logic is the problem with identity politics in general, which is lifting the identity marker over the individual. Or alternatively, judging people purely on the basis of their racial group. The problem is you assume that all white people are in a position of safety and security, while all minorities are not in a position of safety and security, and that they're powerless. I mean, even by this definition, it doesn't actually exclude blacks from being racist to whites, like Zimbabwe, where Mugabe's government had all the power over the whites, but we'll keep our focus on the West. This is an example of out-of-touch academic language that is alienating and divisive in the real world. Like, who is gonna buy that white people can't be racially abused?
Black people can't be racist. Prejudice, yes, but not racist. Racism describes a system of disadvantage based on race. Black people can't be racist since we don't stand to benefit from such a system.
This narrow definition doesn't even take into account hate crimes. A crime is outside of the system. It's not condoned by the system. It's a random act of hate, kind of like the one that we began this video with. As hard as it may be to understand this, there are places dotted across the West where white people are the minority, and all pent-up anger against white people can be hurled on them. When Pakistani gangs rape white preteen girls in Europe, calling them white whores, that is a hate crime. That is racism against white people committed by a minority. What would it matter that on paper she has institutional power? It means nothing. All the power in that situation is in the hands of those men.
In which she talks of how they called her an infidel, and how they abused her race and her lack of Islamic faith, and justified treating her in this way because they viewed her as less than, because they believe themselves to be Muslim supremacists. People have cared for their reputations over the safety of children in this country being raped and drugged and passed around like meat because of the bigotry and the prejudices of these Pakistani Muslim men who were looking down on these children as less than, as inferior, as some form of infidel that doesn't deserve honor or dignity. This scandal involving 27 cities with probably thousands of underage young girls, it must lead to a Stephen Lawrence-style national inquiry looking into what the institutional failures have been. There has been failures on an institutional level in the care homes up and down this country. There have been failures on an institutional level in the police up and down this country. And there have been failures on an institutional level in local Labour councils, probably not only Labour, but mainly Labour councils up and down this country, because people have been scared of being called racist.
No one really makes a fuss because she's just a working class girl. Her white privilege does nothing to give her protection. That wasn't racism you experienced, darling. It was just bigotry. But that happened in Europe, you say. Well, let's return back to this continent. In New York City, a woman had her throat cut open by a black man. And when the police asked why he did it, he said because she was a white woman. You can argue the semantics all you want, but that won't distract the majority of sane Americans from seeing that this woman was almost murdered because he didn't like white people. And as I said from the beginning, we can debate about how common these crimes are, but the reality is they do happen. The idea white people cannot receive racism is basically a free pass bestowed on all minorities to treat white people however they want. And granted, it may not be damaging when white people are together, but what happens when they're alone? When they are left alone with minorities who hate white people, their fate rests solely on just how prejudiced the minorities are. Yes, black people experience being ganged up by white people. I didn't say that didn't happen, and I didn't say that wasn't a problem. All I'm saying is the reverse can happen. Like, what good on both sides does it actually do to tell minorities that they cannot be racist to white people? That whatever they say or do to a member of that group is understandable because of what another member of that group may have done. When we keep in mind that black people commit a disproportionate amount of hate crimes, ask yourself, how is this benefiting blacks or non-blacks? Maybe to academics it sounds like you're evening the scales, but it's further destroying race relations. Overcorrecting bigotry by giving free passes to be bigoted will not bring everyone to an even playing field, and it will not bring harmony. Innocent people will be caught up in these tit-for-tat racial attacks. I think Robin DiAngelo would agree with this, where the average white American does not view themselves as being part of a racial group. Nor do they feel accountable for that group because they view themselves as individuals. Individuals who may never have held any negative views of other races, individuals who have gone their whole life treating people with respect. Like, if you're a socialist, think of the working class man who's always kept to himself and been kind to other people. He's worked his whole life to provide for his family, living paycheck to paycheck. Like, you know that there's millions of white Americans who still live in poverty, waiting for their supposed white privilege to kick in. These people, whose vast majority have never done any ill to blacks, then start saying in the media that they have privilege, that they are racist crackers who have profited from the suffering of minorities. And they look around and think, what privilege? I live in a trailer park. My brother is on opioids. My parents divorced. This is how you create resentful enemies where there weren't enemies before. This is how you turn the traditional working class against you. This is why the Democrats are so bad at appealing to their base and they go and vote for Trump. All of this because some out-of-touch, wealthy Harvard professors were projecting their own easy life onto all the other white people. You really have poisoned the youth from potentially being the most colorblind generation. You threw race back in their face, you plastered it all over the media, you told children that they are different from their classmates and they should be ever aware of it. When a child is in school, they view what is around them as normal. So you had a chance to raise children not noticing any meaningful differences in race. You could have had a generation who viewed races as interchangeable. That's how I was before I encountered identitarians. Look, you can go on pretending your ideology is somehow helping America. That's totally cool. But what we'll see is a split. We'll see people who would have been neutral slowly converge into two camps. They will either submit themselves as sinners by blood and indulge minorities to do as they please unto them as a form of reparations.
And please, show me where it says that protests are supposed to be polite and peaceful.
Or, on the flip side, they'll see a need to fight for their own self-interest. They'll see a need to revive white identity. Not only will they see that whiteness is not a bad thing, many of them will just go further. They'll create white advocacy groups. All the things that you fear, they will do, and the tribalism we're currently living under will accelerate. As much as the left can't see it, white identity really isn't prevalent in America. When you are the majority, you don't really view yourself as being part of a racial group. But if the left isn't careful, they will inadvertently awaken the sleeping lion that is white power. Now let me wind down on this point. I know what people are going to say about me. They're going to say that I'm racist, I'm prejudiced, and I don't like black people. This is going to sound like virtue signaling, but I really do mean this. I want black people to do well in this country. I want black people to have success, and I want their lives to improve. It is a genuine human tragedy what has happened to African Americans. And I'll say this, while slavery existed all across the world, the form it took on the Western continent is probably the most brutal. If it's any consolation, a quarter of my ancestors were brought to America on the transatlantic slave routes. My ancestors lived in Baltimore. It's devastating seeing these cities decade after decade staying the same. It benefits no one, least of all, the blacks living there. My criticism is solely on the privileged people pushing reverse racism and a bigotry of low expectations. They're the ones this is directed to. I'm talking about the ones who believe indulging bad behavior will somehow in a roundabout way help disadvantaged people. Bad behavior only breeds bad behavior, which, by the way, continues bad living conditions. There really is a lot to cover on the issue of race that goes far beyond the scope of this video, so let's conclude returning to the accusation of BYU's racism. The question is not so much, is racism a problem? Because most of us agree that it is a problem, and it does exist to some degree across America. The question is really how much of a problem is it, and what do we do about it? I've in no way said discrimination or abusive behavior is a tolerable thing. What I'm getting at is we have to give our attention and our response proportionate to the severity of the problem. Here's the reality. When the public focuses on one thing, they can actually do a lot. They can do a lot of good and a lot of bad. But the trade-off is they can't focus on all things at the same time. We have a finite attention. And so we have to decide if we're under-focusing on some issues and over-focusing on others, because we can't do all of them. So does someone shouting a slur need to make national news? No, not really. That's not to say it's not a problem, but does it require all of our attention? No, it doesn't. I want black people to have success in this country. I want them to rise out of poverty and their standard of living to improve. We all want that. But I don't believe these tactics will bring that about. Trying to shame white people into changing will work on some, but it won't work on the majority. And excusing bad behavior in black people will not improve their lives.